thought about it and his aides talked about it, they came up with this very iconic notion. Yes, we'll go to St. Augustine. After all, it's the oldest segregated community in the United States of America. Think of how that resonated with the press. It resonated extraordinarily well with the press. The press thought, we need to be there, we need to cover it. And if any of you were around in that period of time, and some of you obviously were, judging from your hair color, on the evening news, every night, literally, was something that was taking place in St. Augustine, Florida. Now, what King sought to do when he came into St. Augustine was build on the local movement. He had a local movement he could rely on that would produce the manpower and woman power necessary to carry forward the movement. He also thought, because it was a religious community, that he might get the backing of the churches. He was sadly mistaken in that regard and found that neither the Catholic Church nor the Episcopal Church, which were two churches which didn't appoint their ministers or priests from within, stood aside while much of the demonstrations took place and refused to participate, or in fact fought at every step of the way to block progress, to block discussion, to block racial change. So King looked at St. Augustine. He saw a black college. He thought, well, there's a potential for significant manpower to come from that black college. Perhaps I can rely on that to help us persist. The one thing that King and SCLC was interested in, of course, first and foremost, was not St. Augustine, was not the local movement. It was the passage, the adoption of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Dr. Hailing, the Reverend Goldie Eubanks, the Twines, etc., all sacrificed enormously to support the movement that Dr. King brought to St. Augustine. Because they were completely overshadowed by it, they had to take a back seat to it, that when Dr. King came into the community and brought SCLC, they took charge and they provided the leadership. That was extraordinarily difficult because what King was after was in part what the local movement leaders were after, but not exclusively. The local leaders wanted the change in the community. They wanted a biracial commission. They wanted substantive conversations between blacks and whites to bring about progress. For King, the passage of the Civil Rights Act would achieve that for all black Americans and all of Americans. But St. Augustine was only an instrument in the path to achieve that. And so St. Augustine found itself in the midst of all of this crisis, and how did it respond? Well, the community became extraordinarily divided. If you were white and progressive at all, you were alienated. You were outcast. You weren't invited to gatherings of friends who had been friends for life. They didn't want to hear about your support or your feeling that this movement was somehow right, and that somehow we had to address it constructively. And so they turned their back on it. It became the white community as represented by Mayor Joseph Shelley, by Dr. Hartgrove Norris, the head of the John Birch Society, by the city police chief, the county sheriff, by the city attorney. All of these folks spoke in unison on behalf of resistance, opposition, defeat of the movement. And it was in that context that King unfolded the demonstrations, the massive demonstrations in St. Augustine that took place over Easter of 1964 and then in the spring and early summer of 1964. It was a horrific period, a period in which there's no way to describe it but saying, is that what we're fully capable of doing to one another over the issue of equal rights and freedom and opportunity? And yet it was. And so in the context as events unfolded in St. Augustine, the leadership of the white community blamed it all on communism. The African American leadership of the civil rights movement were inspired by communists. There's no other way to see it. Otherwise they'd be happy with their lot in life and stay home and off the streets. The other depressing thing for me was in the course of my interviews with a lot of different people, I talked at length to Mayor Joseph Shelley, who was an honorable man in lots of ways, but who could not look past his racial bias. He treated lots of African Americans in the community, one of the few white physicians who did so. And yet, at one level, he could never see blacks and whites in association. He opened up to me in surprising ways, and it turned out one of the reasons he did was because his son had been killed in Vietnam, and I was a Vietnam veteran, and I had served at the same time his son had, and so he wanted to ask me all sorts of questions because he was hurting deeply inside. And it was in the course of those conversations, which I think for the first time he began to understand the hurt and the pain that African Americans in St. Augustine felt.